Very exciting chat to bring you today here and Off the Podium. An inspirational chat about recovery, perseverance, and everything else that comes from it. We've got two guests on the show today to learn about this fantastic story. Our first guest, a two-time Olympic American sprint kayaker, competed at the Atlanta and Sydney Olympics, and at the Sydney Olympics had the honour of carrying the flag into Stadium Australia for the US, survived a terrible accident in the 80s to get to that point to compete in two Olympics, and has an amazing career and story and everything else that comes with that. It's a pleasure, first of all, to welcome to Off the Podium Cliff Meidl. Cliff, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you for having us.
And also joining us, a man who very much helped Cliff on this journey, a doctor with an esteemed career, was a chief of plastic surgery for 25 years at Harvard UCLA, published 3 books on plastic surgery, worked on a variety of television shows, other media, gained global recognition, and a very good friend of Cliff. And we're very much looking forward to hearing how he forms a part of this story as well. Please welcome to Off the Podium, Dr. Malcolm Lesavoy. Malcolm, first of all, thank you too for joining us here on Off the Podium.
Thank you for inviting us. We appreciate it very much.
I am so excited to learn more about this story and for our listeners to hear more about it. Before we get into what happened and everything that came from that, I'd just like a bit of background from both of you, sort of where you were both at before coming into this situation. I mean, Cliff, for you, first of all, the journey in the sport of kayaking. Were you a young athlete that got into kayaking young? I mean, were you a sporty athlete that was sort of trying your hand at everything? Give us a bit of a background on how you ended up as an Olympic kayaker.
Definitely by accident. That's the story right there. I was a young kid, like we all are, aspiring young kids with a lot of dreams in their minds, and we want to kind of go out there and mimic our heroes. And for me, I played a lot of soccer growing up, so I did a lot of running sports and did a lot of that kind of stuff. But I remember one time I was introduced to canoe paddling, outrigger paddling, when I was 16 years of age. But that was all of the experience that I had doing that type of water sports. I mean, I did do some swimming and things of that nature, but most of my sports were all focused around running. Like when I was in high school, cross country, as I mentioned, soccer, doing a lot of martial arts growing up and doing sports of that nature.
I'm so intrigued to find out how that then journey obviously moves into that, and we'll get to that. Malcolm, for yourself, I mean, we don't generally ask this question to our guests on this show because we're often talking to Olympians and athletes, but for yourself, becoming a doctor, was this something that you grew up always wanting to achieve, and then also getting into plastic surgery as well? Was that sort of always a goal, or did you sort of just transition into that at one point during your medical career?
Well, that is a good question. I came to the field of medicine, I guess, pretty straightforward. I was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania. My parents were just wonderful people, and my father was in business, and they always wanted me to achieve, whatever I wanted, and supported me and helped me in that way. I really liked science. I was the kid who would find a dead rabbit out in the field and kind of would dissect it because I was interested in seeing what was inside. And I just went through high school and then through my university training, University of North Carolina, and decided that I was going to major in political science, which had nothing to do with medicine necessarily, but it did have the word science at the end. And but I did take all the required scientific and requirements like physics and biology and biochemistry and all those things. And then when I applied for medical school, at my interviews, they always said, well, why did you major in political science when all your competitors, all these other people are majoring in other things like, anatomy and physiology and things of that sort. And I said, well, I wanted to have a general overall education, and I'm glad I did that because it served me well. And but I then went to medical school and then continued on, going to be a surgeon, and because I like fixing things, and I like dealing with people. And so to be a plastic surgeon, at least in America, we have to go through full training in general surgery, so taking care of gunshot wounds and trauma and all those kinds of situations with gallbladders and cancer and situations like that. But then subsequently, to be a plastic surgeon, you continue on for another 2 or 3 years. So basically, you're about 34 years old or 35 when you've finished all your training. Because in plastic and reconstructive surgery, basically, I define it as the surgery of the skin of the body and all of its contents, because we work on all of the contents. So we do reconstruction of all those situations, including surgery of the hand and dealing with babies with congenital anomalies, cleft lips and cleft palates, and trauma and muscle flaps, and reconstructing cancer patients, breast cancer, and all types of cancers around the head and neck and the chest, and so on and so forth. So I'm doing exactly what I always dreamed I would be doing, and love doing it every single day.
Fantastic. Always good to hear that that's sort of how it can all turn out. I mean, before we obviously get to what happened in 1986, just one quick question for you, Cliff, again. With what you were talking about with your athletic sort of career, what you were doing before the accident, was it something that you were growing up wanting to become a professional athlete, go to an Olympics? Was this something that you were aspired to before what happened in 1986?
I think that the best answer for that would be no. I mean, I had dreams about, competing in a large arena when I was a young little kid, but I really never knew what that was. I was always I would classify myself as a mediocre type of athlete. But there was one of the things that I did have a lot were there was a lot of mentors that I had around me, and I just dreamt really big, whether it was tangible or intangible. I was influenced by a lot of people in my life growing up. So I had a lot of role models and people that I wanted to be. Was I ever going to get there? That was really a question, in terms of putting that all together later on in my life. But, right out of the blocks, I was just a young kid doing sports and doing things of that nature. And ultimately, that's why I always like to say that I got involved in sprint kayaking because it was an accident. It was something that I ended up going to because I didn't have any other opportunities. And it was a perfect opportunity for me to be able to go to a place and be a part of something.
Speaking of the accident, 1986, you're 20 years old. You're working as an apprentice on a construction site. Tell us the story from there, Cliff. What happened and kind of set you on this path that ultimately would take you to Olympics?
Yeah, so I think, reflecting back as to, kind of setting the stage as to who I was at that time and what I was, what some of my, aspirations were. I was going to a community college locally where I live. And so I was trying to work on that side. I was offered a job opportunity working for a construction company, which obviously I took that venture. But things started to materialize a little bit where there was opportunity that was provided to me, because I think if I look back, it was probably because I was very determined on the job, trying to want to perform the best that I could, for not only myself, but for others. But at the same time, I always like to say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Both my parents, they were immigrants. They had to work very hard at accomplishing and being able to put food on the table for my brother and I growing up. So it was one of those things that was a learned behavior from my parents, and they had taught us well to be very disciplined. And if you want to do the work and you want to accomplish something, you're going to have to go through the process and do it in order to be successful at it. So that kind of laid the foundation for me. I was provided an opportunity to be an apprentice. I was working as a plumber at the time. And that's kind of where it all started and how I got involved in construction, kind of juggling a couple of things at the same time.
Which I can imagine getting involved in something like that. You don't go into accepting an apprenticeship as a plumber going, well, this might take me to an Olympics one day. I mean, it's sort of not a traditional path to sprint kayaking, I can imagine, in the United States.
Yeah, not at all. But I think the thing about it is that, that's a great example and how that parlays into many of the other Olympians and Paralympians that are out there. Typically, you really don't discover yourself until you have to go through extreme hardship, and you have a chance to really look at in the mirror and identify, the tools that you have rather than what you don't. So it's very common across the Olympic platform where there are people that become like I always say, we're all ordinary people with the ability to accomplish the extraordinary. It's something that's from the neck up, and a lot of times it takes an adversity for us to be able to accomplish the extraordinary.
Just quickly, 1986, obviously 2 years removed from the Los Angeles Olympics. You're from California. Had you had an opportunity to witness the Olympics in person? Had you gotten swept up and everything? I mean, can you remember sort of 1984 at all, what that was like for Americans and Californians for the Olympics at that point?
Oh yeah, it was very exhilarating. I was born and raised in the beach town, so I was throwing newspapers at that time because that was kind of my pre-job era as a kid, and I would deliver newspapers to this one gentleman. His name was Tom Hintonhouse, and he was a local pole vaulter and our hometown hero that we had here growing up in Manhattan Beach. So, I always really looked up to him, and I think that the big changing point, and I always like to say, that seed got planted when I saw that Olympic torch being, ran through downtown Manhattan Beach. And I remember the tall ship parades were going by at that time. And that was a very exhilarating time, not only for me, but also for the community of Manhattan Beach where I grew up. But also the city of Los Angeles. I mean, we're hosting an Olympics, and it turned out to be a very successful Olympics.
Yeah, very much so. Changed the entire Olympic movement. A lot of people obviously talk a lot about what the LA Olympics in 84 did for the modern Olympics. For you, Malcolm, just quickly, 1986, going based on what you were saying through your career, I mean, where were you at in 1986? Just before you met Cliff, before this friendship and everything started, I mean, kind of how was your career progressing at that point?
In 1986, you're asking?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in 1986, I was already 10 years at UCLA as full-time professor and doing all kinds of reconstructive surgery, teaching residents, have a major research laboratory going. So I had kind of 3 or 4 jobs going all at the same time, none of which paid me very much, but did cost a lot of time and effort. I was doing exactly what I had dreamed of doing all along, going into plastic and reconstructive surgery, kind of not doing very much cosmetic surgery, which everybody thinks is what plastic surgery is about, doing breasts and tummy tucks and facelifts and those jobs, but just the opposite. I did maybe 10% of those kinds of cases at that time. Now I'm doing 95% of those cases.
Wow.
As one's career goes on, the types of cases change. But no, in 1986, I was married at the time. I had 3 children and was working as a professor at UCLA, teaching and having a huge practice at UCLA of kind of solving problems that others in reconstructive surgery and general surgery and other types of surgery wouldn't or didn't attack.
Had you gotten involved and swept up in Olympic fever a couple of years beforehand in 1984? If you were in California still in 1984, do you remember that period as well?
Oh yes, no, definitely, because it was a fascinating time. I mean, I was an athlete, if you want to call it that. I went to college on a football scholarship and played football until at North Carolina until I ruined my shoulder in my first year. And my parents said, why don't you settle down and, be a student instead of an athlete or a student athlete. I missed athletics. I mean, I always, while I was in high school, I was on, the basketball team, the football team, and the track team. But when I went to college, I just played football. But no, I follow athletics and in the Olympics, just like everybody does, I think, and excited and inspired by them.
Quite a famous basketballer came from the University of North Carolina. Not sure if you were sort of around about there the same time as Mr. Jordan. Was that sort of around your period?
Yeah, no, I left before I left, and I think I recruited him. No, just kidding. But
The truth is
no,
out.
yeah, he came after me, but also UCLA is pretty well known for their basketball also, because
Yeah.
I think 11 or 12 straight NCAA championships with Coach John Wooden, who actually was a patient of mine in his last year. He died just before he turned 100, and I was asked to go visit him in his apartment here in Westwood in Los Angeles, because he had an injury on his arm, on his hand, and it was a real honor. I took 3 or 4 or 5 of my residents and medical students with me just to meet this great man, Mr. John Wooden, who passed away, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good to sort of get that background to sort of learn where both your lives were at, sort of, and when this obviously accident happened. So, Cliff, you're working on this construction site, you're doing some jackhammering, and then it happens. Let us know. Explain the story from what happened.
Well, I mean, it was just as you had said. I was working on the construction site, operating a jackhammer, and I ended up hitting some power lines, and then that was it. Lights out. After that happened, that incident happened, for me, it was kind of touch and go at the time. I ended up having a cardiac arrest because of the large amount of electricity that had gone through my body. But essentially, all of the responsibilities and all of the worries and everything that kind of go along with that were thrown in the lap of my mom and my dad. At the time, they essentially had to drive the bus. I was very fortunate that I was resuscitated, but I did suffer some exit wounds with electricity. It behaves much differently than, for example, getting burned by a fire. It exits throughout the body. It's not, from the outside in, it's from the inside out. So I was burned over 15% of the body, but I think most of that chaos kind of happened, when my mother was alerted after she got that telephone call from the superintendent on the job site saying that, I was involved in this bad accident and we don't know if Cliff's going to be able to live. So you can imagine what a parent goes through at that time. And it's, it doesn't necessarily have to be an incident like that, but, a lot of us go through adversity in life. We don't know, what different types of shapes, sizes, and color the adversity is that we face, but we're all going to face adversity at some time in our life. And we're going to have to get through the process. And it's a management process dealing with adverse situations, or, for a lot of the audience out there, it may be a goal that one may have, a dream that one may have, but, it's an adversity. We have to face it. And I think that if we all take a couple of steps back and take a broad-based look at it, it's all about being able to manage difficulties and be able to, when you get knocked down, you dust yourself off and get back up. But, initially it was a very difficult time for my mom because she shows up in the trauma center and she has, dealt with these cards. And then she had to make some very big decisions at the time.
Because I believe the accident sort of not only was it the electricity, but it sort of forced you back into the jackhammer itself, which did damage to your legs, which ultimately is what will lead you to meeting Malcolm. So, I mean, do you have memory of this? Is this something that, you have memory of, or is it a case of you hit the power lines and then you kind of wake up in hospital a couple of days later and go, Mum, Dad, what the hell just happened?
Yeah, that's what happened.
Wow.
I thought I was in a dream. I looked up, my parents were wearing these white coats and I had this pain on my chest and really didn't know what it was. But one of my biggest concerns at the time is what happened to the coworker that I was working with, because, we're a very close culture on the job site. And I was very concerned about that. I had been intubated, so I was very hoarse in my voice at the time. But the first thing that I did was called him on the telephone. Obviously, I had my mother make that telephone call, but, he was shocked. In fact, he thought that somebody was playing a joke on him, but I basically called to tell him that, I had lived. But, the scope of what actually had happened really didn't dawn on me at all. my initial thing was I wanted to get out of bed. And my mother had told me at the time that, I was involved in this severe incident and you can't get out of bed and you can't walk.
Because I can imagine, reflecting on it now, as everyone does with age, we think differently. We can look at moments like that and see it from, say, what your mother was thinking at the time. But I mean, you're 20 years old at the time. As you said, you're wanting to get out of bed. You're thinking, this is just a scratch. I'll be fine. I'll be back at work tomorrow. Which I can imagine in hindsight now, you look back and go like, well, what was I thinking?
Yeah, I think that the realization of what you go through and what I had gone through at the time didn't initially hit. I mean, I knew I was injured and I knew I was in a bad accident, but learning towards what the magnitude of it was and how I was going to get through that slowly kind of crept up on me as time went on and on. So it was kind of,
So I was going to say 30,000 volts basically had gone through your body, and that's essentially 5 times greater than the electric chair, which is, I mean, insane to think that you can survive that. And then, as I said, the legs, obviously, there was an issue there. I believe your parents stepped in to obviously say, hey, no, let's not amputate. Let's maybe look at some other options. And that is then what led to Malcolm coming involved in that. So, I mean, again, do you remember sort of thought process at that point of the possibility of losing your legs? And are you on board? Obviously, I can imagine with your parents like, hey, yeah, absolutely. Let's look at other options before automatically we go to amputation.
Yeah, I mean, I was absolutely not that coherent at all. And this was probably about 3.5 to 4 weeks after I had my accident. I can remember very clearly 3 days in that time period. Everything else was kind of a fog. But I do remember the moment very well, when that discussion was up. And then, my mother was faced with a big circumstance at the time. And, my family learned from this process that, this may possibly happen. I was going in and out of these various different surgical procedures where they were kind of debrising the various different areas of my burns and being able to do various different skin grafts, like on my back and my toes. In the back of the head, I had these areas patched up, but the biggest concern was what were they going to do with both of my knees? I had about a third of the knee compartment that was burned bilaterally on both legs. So that was always a big question as to what are they going to do? And I think the first time that became a big crisis was my dad and my brother, who's 4 years younger than I am. They were coming up in an elevator, and these doctors had walked in to the elevator, and they were doing their, chit chat for the day, and they're talking. And then one of the doctors had said, "Hey, did you hear about that kid up in the intensive care unit?" And the doctors were talking about it. And my dad was standing in the back of the elevator, kind of really realizing, what was happening. And the doctor has said that, well, there's probably a good chance they're going to have to do bilateral AKs. Which is amputation above the knees. And, you can imagine when that word got up to my mother, that was always something that they very much feared that I would have to face. And so that became a reality.
Which then, Malcolm, I'd love to hear the story about how then you got connected to this case, how you were made aware of Cliff's situation and everything. Because, 1986, I can't imagine something like Google doesn't exist back then, of course. So, Cliff's parents aren't just jumping online to do that. But, do you remember that initial contact and when you were first made aware of the situation with Cliff?
Yes, I do, actually. But just to back up a little bit for your listeners, how electrical burns affect the body, because it is a little confusing. And I always mention that there are 4 different kinds of burns that one can sustain. One of them is the fire, or hot flames. Everybody knows how people are burned if your hand is too close to the fire or whatever. It can happen that way. There are chemical burns. There are these very caustic situations that people can come in contact with that affect the outer layers of our body, skin. There are electrical burns, such as what Cliff sustained. And then you can also be burned by your girlfriend or by your wife, obviously, too. But that's another story.
Different story. Another podcast.
That's much more difficult to correct. But as far as electrical burns are concerned, what happens is that at the point of entry, like with Cliff, with this metal object into the electrical line, the energy of the electricity flows through your body. And just like Cliff mentioned earlier, it's an internal burn rather than an external burn. And so the energy of the electricity flows through your body through the points of least resistance. In other words, it flows through soft tissue like muscle or nerves. And then lastly, bones. And then eventually it has to exit someplace. And in his particular case, because he fell down kind of next to the jackhammer and into this ditch, probably the back of his head touched the dirt of the ditch, and therefore he had some electrical energy pass out the back of his skull. It blew out one of his toes from the actual energy flowing down through his lower extremities. He had some exit energy of the electrical burns of the electrical energy go out his back. But most of it actually, or a lot of it, went through his knees, and that's what he had suggested how they were injured specifically. Now, so the doctors at the hospital where he was originally taken to cared for these superficial areas that had been affected by the exit of this energy, the back of his skull, his toes, his back, so on and so forth. And they were trying to address his lower extremities at the knee level. But because that joint is covered by just a little bit of skin, as we all know, and that most likely received the most amount of energy because that's where an exit is. That's why people, by the way, die in the electric chair with much less energy, because all this energy is confined and there's no exit. The exit is within the body, and therefore heart stops, brain fries, so on and so forth. But fortunately with Cliff, there was an exit, and that's why he didn't die. I mean, he was severely injured. His heart was affected, obviously, and well, we're still wondering about his brain, but I think the brain is working pretty good right now. So anyhow, the doctors, after this period of time, figured they were kind of stymied, and there wasn't anything that they could do about the knees, and so the lower extremities were basically useless, and so they decided that they were going to remove both of his legs above the knee, and therefore he would need a prosthesis that is kind of difficult to manage for a whole lifetime. So at the time I was in my clinic at UCLA seeing patients, and I got a phone call from this lady, and it was his mother. And she said that her son was in this predicament and was in this hospital kind of in about 30 or 40 miles away from where UCLA is, down in the South Bay. And that they had plans the following morning to have both of his legs amputated. Could I do anything? I said, well, yeah, it's a pretty tall order, and not sure what I could do, but I don't work at that hospital, so we'll have to find somebody else. Evidently, she heard that I was doing all this kind of crazy surgery that was somewhat innovative, at least at the time, not anymore, obviously. And I said, well, I can't go. And then I think we basically said goodbye to one another. And then I think 5 minutes later, I'm not exactly sure, but she called back and she was crying and said, please come and see my son, and so on and so forth. And so I acquiesced, and I said, okay, I'll come down there and visit him just as a family member, really, and see if there's something that I could do. And so that's my recollection of that moment.
And at that point, you're talking about sort of doing some things that maybe were, experimental at the time. Had you come across a case like this before? Is that sort of where maybe you were a bit more intrigued to have a look at it, or at least visit to kind of see if this is something that you could do, or is this something you'd never come across before at the time?
Well, in plastic reconstructive surgery, there are many ways of skinning a cat, so to speak, and that is that I'm always trying to think out of the box. I'm always trying to think of faster and more efficient ways of doing a particular procedure. I mean, if you look in any plastic surgery textbook, many of these procedures, not this particular procedure, but many procedures are all written and described, and so one can go by the book, so to speak. But if you think out of the box and try to improve on a particular procedure by doing something a little bit different or more efficiently, then that possibly could help. This particular procedure that I did on Cliff was not particularly my invention or anything like that, but it wasn't done very much at that time. So I cannot take credit for inventing this. I have invented maybe 10 or 12 different procedures that others had not done before. But I think she had heard about a paper that I had written because I had I had done something first in the world, and that was a young man who was 17 or 18 years old had his leg amputated in an accident. He was actually driving a motor scooter, and he was brought to UCLA and asked me to take care of him. And his leg came in another ambulance. So there were two separate ambulances, one with the patient, the other with the leg. Wow. And there had never been a replantation. In other words, a put back of a leg after it had been cut off. And so I was fortunate to do this only because I was naive and stupid and say, well, geez, I can do this, and hook up the arteries and the veins and the bones and the tendons and the nerves. And it turned out that it was the first one done in the world. And so wow. It was, and I published that in 1977, actually. And I think maybe somebody had read something of my publications and had told her of this. And so she said, well, maybe this guy can do something on my son's leg. So I did come down and visit Cliff while he was in the hospital at that time.
Which, Cliff, you obviously mentioned some of that was a bit of a blur and everything that was going on, but do you remember the first meeting with Malcolm?
Oh, absolutely. And it was a huge turning point in my entire process and my, well-being. I remember that, Dr. Lesavoy was going to come and take a look at the legs. I know my mom went out on this quest, but obviously I wasn't a part of that because I was in the hospital and she was out there contacting Dr. Lesavoy. But I remember very clearly this one evening I was laying in bed, obviously very apprehensive about what was going to happen. As a burn survivor, one of the biggest risks are outside infections. So I had a cast all the way up to my hips and all the way down to my ankles that were enclosed all of my wounds. So I was a very fragile state. And so I knew that in order to look at these things, one was going to have to open up these casts and all that. But the first thing I do remember is that, when Dr. Lesavoy walked into the room, he did something very unique. He acknowledged, my mom and my dad that were sitting there and then kind of acknowledged the doctors, but came directly to my bed and put his hand on my shoulder. And he says, "Hi, Cliff, I'm Mal Lesavoy, and I'm here to take a look at your legs." And so for all of us in the audience, you think that, someone's going to walk in, with the white coat and everything like that, like all doctors. And, he came in here with his jeans and his cowboy boots, and he had big biceps, and he still does at the time. And so this man walks into my life and puts his hand on my shoulder. And, I like to always refer to that as that was the initial flame that he lit in my heart, that there's just a possibility of this little ounce of hope that this man might be able to do some good and might be able to save my legs. And so that was a major turning point at that time because, a lot has to go into that equation. Obviously he had the incredible skill set in order to perform the surgery. But for me at that time, I was hopeless. I wanted to throw in the towel and I really didn't see any hope for my life at that time. I was very depressed. And all of a sudden, somebody enters your life and sparks this hope in your heart that you might possibly be able to do some good and be able to save the legs. And that was my initial meeting. And of course, an examination had to follow with that. And Dr. Lesavoy said that, he's going to take a look at my legs. And so he had to open up the casts. And I remember very clearly at that time, he had mentioned, don't look down. And obviously I'm not very good at instructions. So I ended up looking down, and there's two very distinct things that I have a takeaway from that time point. Was one of them, even today, I still have that smell in my nose of what that burned flesh still smelled like. And then obviously the second part is realizing the magnitude of my injuries. At that point, I never really saw what my legs look like here. As Dr. Lesavoy was kind of hovering and doing the examination over my legs, I could actually see the entire exposed knee compartments with just the bone being exposed there. And I knew at that time that my life was going to be completely different. The days of being able to do sports, run on the beach, be a normal kid were completely out of the window. I was going to have to reinvent myself at the time if I could even do that.
Which I'm going to get back to what happened with the surgery and how everything was able to go from that point in just a moment. But saying that, harrowing experience, was that something that you can then internalize, say, when you're at the Olympics or when you're pushing towards selection or when you've got something troubling you in your life, that is a point you can sort of reflect on to think, well, this is where I was to this is where I have become now?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're faced as humans with adversity, and anytime that we can go through the process, it's a learning experience for us. And it's a building block in order for us to be able to not only get through the process, but be able to accomplish the process. And I think that, every step of the way, it was unique in itself, all the way from having to have the surgery done to realizing the magnitude of the injury, faced with how am I going to get through this process? How am I going to be able to learn and walk again, to kind of getting back to trying to get back into a normal life. And then as the rest goes on, it's history kind of. But, looking back, each one of those segments are not only a learning process for an individual going through adversity, but it's an important stepping stone of being able to feel what it was like going through that process and being able to take that hardship and applying it to other things that we're going to have to be faced with. Going through the surgery was one thing, and then learning how to walk again. All of that was just an application of one to another to another. It's just taking micro steps. Because, we can't just go from A to Z and say, hey, I'm going to accomplish this goal or I'm going to get through this difficulty in life. It just doesn't work that way. We have to take the small steps. Oftentimes we have to take several steps back before we can even move forward, but it's all a step-by-step process.
So Malcolm, I'd love to learn then from that initial consult to obviously saving the legs and everything that came from there. So give us a bit of an indication what you saw and then sort of what did you do then to be able to save Cliff's legs?
Well, initially, not even initially, but the doctors there actually refused to release him because they kind of, I don't know why, maybe jealousy, maybe money, maybe insurance, maybe who knows? I really don't know why. But I kind of talked to them in a nice way and then in not such a nice way to allow them to have me transfer Cliff up to UCLA so we could at least attempt to do some reconstructive procedures to save these legs. And so they finally did acquiesce. And the following morning, I guess it was that following morning, they allowed him to be transferred up to UCLA. And then we operated on Cliff to do some reconstructive procedures. And I told the doctors at that time, listen, you have nothing to lose. If we fail and I can't cover this area, we can't save these legs, then I'll send him back and you can take his legs off. But aside from that, you have nothing to lose. Why would you be obstinate and not allow us to at least try? So they then allowed Cliff to come, and we went ahead and did a number of procedures, and we were moderately, actually pretty good, successful. basically the surgery that I did was to get to debride all of the dead bone. It was all black and burnt from the exit injuries of the electrical injury. Remove that dead bone and then try to get good tissue, good independent vascularized tissue, muscle basically, from the back of his leg, the calf, called the gastrocnemius muscle, and move that around to the front of his knee to cover his joint, cover the dead bone, well, the dead bone we had removed, and what was left of the bone, and then put a skin graft on top of this muscle. The whole basics in reconstructive surgery is nutrition, is to have some piece of soft tissue, either a piece of muscle or skin or whatever, that has its own blood supply. And this muscle, the gastrocnemius muscle, our big calf muscle that we have, that actually originates above the knee and continues on down to our ankle to flex our ankle. I can detach it from its distal insertion, which is at the ankle area, and lift it up based on its nerve and blood supply and move it around to the front of the knee to cover this big space. And we did that on both of his legs. And then on top of that, because you just can't have raw muscle exposed, then we took skin grafts from his thighs and put that on top of the muscle. And that's basically what saved those legs.
Wow.
And then he needed some revisions, a few revisions afterwards. But the most important thing wasn't really the surgery. Surgery was pretty straightforward, to be very honest. And but then following this was rehabilitation, and that is probably more difficult than any of the surgical procedures that he had undergone, and probably more difficult emotionally than anything that he had ever in his entire life of 20 years, experienced. And that brings us to the next segment.
Yeah, well, before I find a little bit more about that rehabilitation, I mean, were you confident that you could save the legs? I mean, obviously you're fighting for it. You're saying, well, what have we got to lose? But were you confident that this could happen?
Yeah, with my name is Lesavoy, and my parents instilled confidence in me, and I always kind of feel that I can fix anything. I can really fix anything. And it's not for, it doesn't mean that I haven't failed, and I failed many times, but I learned from failures. And this was a tremendous challenge. And I wanted this challenge. I really did want this challenge, and especially for a 20-year-old kid, my God. I mean, it'd be terrible for him to have the rest of his life, although there are many, many, many successful people with above knee amputations, not so many with bilateral above knee amputations, but we're seeing, oh my God, so sad of our Americans and Australians, I'm sure, coming back from the wars, missing both legs and an arm, missing both arms and one leg, and have smiles on their faces and have persevered, which is it's unbelievable. The surgery is the most minor, most minute part of this entire story of Cliff Meidl. It's got nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with Cliff Meidl.
Well, this is where I want to hear a little bit more about Cliff post-surgery, the rehabilitation. I mean, give us an idea of the mindset going into that, and sort of how long did this process take? Because you have to learn how to walk again, something that we all, majority of us, take for granted still to this day, things like that. I mean, obviously as a 20-year-old, this is something you never thought you were going to face.
Right. That's true. But I think that going back to what Dr. Lesavoy had said, where, the after the surgery is the important part, but one has to really go back and reflect on one of the most important parts about this entire equation. It's his personality and his ability to be able to, he always talks about, thinking outside the box. He's one of the best at what he does. But he's also one of the best at being able to inspire other people to be the best that they can be. And I think that that's where that kinship came together. I talk about the first flame of hope when he walked into the room, when I was laying there hopeless, and he was able to provide the surgical part of it. But the other part of it came when he saw me in my position, knowing how difficult going through in adversity is, and where he came up with that second flame of hope that he had lit in my heart, where he challenged me and he said, listen, you got to get through this. And he understood. I was a very young kid at the time. And he said, you have to get through this. And in order to do this, you're going to have to learn how to walk. And he inspired me at that time to be able to just maximize myself and do the best that I possibly can and take one step at a time. And that's how I interpreted that. And that's when I basically went gung ho. And we made a bet. He says, when do you want to get out of here? And I said, within 4 weeks. And he says, okay, well, you're going to have to go from a bed to a wheelchair. And that's kind of when the music stopped at that standpoint, because that was a realization that I'm never going to be able to do that. There's no possible way. How am I going to get from the bed to a wheelchair when I had these jello-like muscles on both of my legs? I was in a lot of pain. I had a lot of emotional hurdles that I had to go through, but it was that persistence that he had at the time, knowing how to push my buttons in the right way to motivate me and inspire me to be able to be the best that I could be with what I had. And that's what he did, point blank, hands down, no argument to that at all whatsoever. He inspired me to do that. And he essentially took off his doctor's lab coat and became that inspirer, that role model, and that mentor for me to be able to be the best that I could be. And I took that with all my might at that time in order to get through this adversity. And ultimately, to make a short story long, I learned how to walk again, but it wasn't easy. It was every day was a fight. Every day was a struggle, and every day was a failure. But being able to be taught and guided through that, if you manage these difficulties and you just keep working hard and pushing and pushing and pushing through the pain and the difficulty, you will get through that adversity. And I think that after the 4 weeks, turning around and looking back, being able to walk on these parallel bars that just seemed to be completely doubtful in my mind, I actually accomplished it. And wow. I realized that if I could get through this, I'm going to be able to get through anything that I put my mind to, because that was a very painful process mentally, along with the physical part of it. But, to say that, Dr. Lesavoy provided this incredible surgery, there is hands down no argument. He's the best at the best, and he fixed my legs. But he did a lot more than just that. He stepped in and was the mentor, was the role model, and inspired me to be the best that I could be. And that was basically the launching point for me. Once I got through that, I learned that this skill set can be applied in many different facets of life. I wasn't walking around like Einstein and being able to apply everything, but that learned behavior from going through that process initially, I was able to apply that in almost everything else that I did, whether it was continuing my rehabilitation or going to school or going back to school and getting an education or getting involved in sports or, socializing amongst other people, which was a very tough process. I was very ashamed of who I was at the time. That all stemmed from that foundation of skill sets that I learned during that very first process.
I was going to ask, was he wearing cowboy boots the whole time when he would come in and visit you? Because I kind of like this idea of doctors, dressing like that with, some bulging biceps and that sort of stuff. So California in the 80s was obviously a different world.
Yeah, the cowboy boots, 100%.
Oh, he's got him on.
Look at that.
Wow. Okay, then. I like this.
Yeah.
This is a great way of doing that. Which, through all of that, at what point did it sort of click to you, or was this maybe a little bit after, that you wanted to pursue something in the sporting realms and obviously led you into kayaking? I mean, was this something through all that rehabilitation and adversity that you wanted to set yourself another challenge? I mean, sort of how did that come about?
Well, it came through by accident. As I had mentioned before, but it came through a lot of struggle. I was lost at the time. As I mentioned, I was athletic growing up, and I had a huge void in my life. Now I had these neomobilizers, and I had to learn how to walk again and reteach all of that. And I was going through a lot of struggle. I was going through those stages of grievance where I was very angry and depressed. And I kind of had to find another way how to deal and cope with this all. And so my brother basically approached me, and, he essentially said, take a look in the mirror and see what you have. And I had a very difficult time not only accepting me, but understanding some of the skill sets and the tools that I had. And my brother Norm essentially said, you can't use your legs, but you can use your upper body. You can use your brain. And you could use that. Why don't you get involved in outrigger canoe paddling? And at that point, I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to go down and start canoeing around all these people. I did it when I was 16 for a little bit. But I did not want to go down there and have all these people judge and all of that stuff. It was just not what I wanted to do. But my brother was persistent. He got me to go down there. And I think that, everything happens, when you hear about these stories of overcoming adversity, these are long processes. It's a long time that people go through adversity. Things don't happen right away and right off the bat. You just don't get those quick fix rewards. This was over a long period of time. And, getting involved in this canoe club, when I look back, it was a long process, a 10-year process. And yeah, I developed incredible friends, and even I still have them today, and I socialize with them all the time. I was more fit than I ever had been in my life. I was exposed to a new sport. I had all these opportunities, but I think that if you're going to hit the nail on the head with a hammer and say, what was that one thing that this sports provided for me at the time, was definitely being a part of something. We all in life want to be a part of something. We want to be accepted. We're all human beings. We're emotional, we're behavioral, and we want to be a part of something. And I think that's what that canoe club, it could have been bowling, it could have been anything, but that application, that innovation process, Dr. Lesavoy talks a lot about being innovative and thinking outside the box. That was my moment of being able to think outside the box, was using the tools that I have and not worrying about what I didn't have. And that was all upper body, and the canoe sport was perfect for me. Once I got involved in canoeing for many years, I started off as a guppy. Then ultimately, I did relatively well, but, I had people inspire me and motivate me. And that's when I was introduced to the Olympic side of sprint canoe and kayak. Very challenging sport. It's like balancing a ball bearing. We have a combination between technique. It's one of the more technical sports in the Olympic Games, especially when you get to high kneel canoeing. It's got to be probably one of the most technical sports, in my opinion. But then you also have that combination of strength and endurance. And so you have this mold of all of this that's going into the sport. So it was a real challenge for me. I loved it. I was inspired by Greg Barton, who was an American Olympian and a hero of mine. I actually got to meet him at a couple of canoe races, which was a big deal for me. He had lower leg limitations, or he has lower leg limitations, and he became a two-time Olympic champion. And that was a big inspiration. I look back, at my life, and as I mentioned earlier in our podcast, that I always dreamt big as a young little kid. In fact, running down that ramp in 7th grade, dreaming about competing in this large arena, but never knowing what it was. Well, that realization and that reality came to during the 1996 Olympics when I was walking down the ramp. The oil was like blood. I was through this. I had this euphoric high. All these people screaming. It was in home turf in the United States. And all of a sudden I realized that, oh my goodness, this is that moment that I always dreamt as a kid. But that could not have happened, I don't think, if I wouldn't have gone through the adversity that I did. I'm not saying that I didn't have the caliber for being an Olympic athlete. I think I just didn't have the necessity to be able to dig really deep into my heart and be able to come up with that determination, that motivation, that persistence, and the grit that it takes to get through adversity. If I wouldn't have had that accident, and if I wouldn't have developed that relationship with Dr. Lesavoy. I always say it's a relationship, because He was the incredible doctor, but he really inspired me to be the best that I can be, which is a very unique circumstance. And I was very fortunate being able to have that opportunity as a young man.
It was a golden period for American canoeing around about that time with Greg, wasn't it? Because
It was.
ultimately the medal drought started, 92 until Nevin got gold last year. But, obviously an amazing period for the sport in the country. I mean, Malcolm, I just quickly, just on everything that Cliff was saying, I mean, Cliff mentions about sort of it was a 10-year journey, but I mean, I would flip that aside and go, it's incredible you can have an accident like that and then less than 10 years later compete at an Olympics. I mean, witnessing his journey from that period to the moment he's sort of talking about there getting to Atlanta. I mean, were you confident that this was something, knowing Cliff, sort of getting to know him over those years, were you confident that once he set himself at those sights that he was able to achieve that? And what was that moment like when you saw him make the Olympics after everything from that first moment to then seeing him walking out there in Atlanta?
You talk about a rush. It really is a rush. But what really happened is it's not exactly as maybe you would think. But I kept leaning on him to get, to start working out, to go from the bed to the wheelchair, from the wheelchair to parallel bars, to start walking. And then after a while, I don't know, Cliff, maybe you remember, but maybe, 3, 4, 5 months or so, I would see you from time to time. And then I totally lost track of Cliff. And 10 years later, not even thinking about it. I mean, it was the time of the Olympics in Atlanta, and my phone starts ringing here in Los Angeles, and people are calling me, say, "Now you got to turn on CBS or NBC. I can't remember. Turn on the TV. There's this guy being interviewed in Atlanta who's an Olympian, who says you saved his life, you saved his legs, you inspired him, and now he's an Olympian." And I turned the TV on. There's Cliff Meidl, being interviewed, by all these people on a number of occasions. Well, after the Atlanta Olympics, and he competed so wonderfully, we reconnected, and we really reconnected. I mean, we were connected before, but now he's you're 30 years old at the time at Atlanta, Cliff?
Yeah.
And then we reconnect. And he's one of my best friends, and we continue to connect, and I'm inspired by him.
Fantastic.
Truly, I mean, just think of what this man has gone through.
Yeah.
Forget the physical problems, but my God, the emotional problems, the cardiac fortitude that this man has. And we've taken trips together, we've lectured together, and 4 years later, I mean, my goodness, in Sydney, at the Sydney Olympics, at the opening ceremonies, as you already have alluded to, 600 member United States Olympic team votes for one person to carry that flag. And who do they vote for? This guy, Cliff Meidl. I mean, from Manhattan Beach, California, you talk about biceps. His biceps are between his ears. And that's where his strength is. His brain, his heart, and he's an inspiration to everybody that he talks to. Everybody. He goes around the country. He goes around the country now, and he's an inspirational speaker. And anybody that meets him and anybody that watches this podcast can feel the energy that he exudes, the confidence that he exudes. And I'm not around him enough, because I need to be inspired just so much by being
the
around.
bromance needs to always grow. That's basically what it is, right? It's got
I agree. I accept it.
Always a bromance. Cliff, just quickly on that. I actually, being the Olympic geek that I am, I have way too many, videos of the Olympics in the past. I have the opening ceremony from Sydney, and I just watched it before this interview just to get the Australian reaction of what they were saying about you as you entered the stadium. And our commentators were, obviously telling the inspiring story. So it was, being told here in Australia and everything as well. But I mean, I can imagine we could sit here for the next hour talking about what that's like to walk in that stadium. But I mean, just that honour of being voted to carry that flag. I mean, is that the moment in your life that stands above many of kind of, almost the biggest honour? And going back to what we're saying, from where you were staring at your exposed bone essentially to all of a sudden walking out in front of 110,000 people with billions of people watching around the world carrying, the flag of your country to represent you in the world.
Yeah, exactly. The most honorable time in my life with that recognition. Definitely that was for me. I know I was kind of nervous at the time because, here I'm holding this pole, and I remember with the American flag, I was so proud and honored to be able to carry the flag. And I remember that there was a lot of chaos going on. And the only thing that I could think about at that time was, whatever you do, Cliff, don't trip, because I still walk like Bambi, right? I still got a limp. And so I had to be very careful because, as you know, there was carpet all over the entire field because they had to protect the field. So there was these folds every once in a while. And I was thinking to myself, don't do that. But here I stood. I was very nervous, at the time, which I'm sure a lot of people are, but at the same time, just filled with all this pride and this incredible honor. And I was my mind was going back and forth, 10 years back, or at that time, 14 years back, thinking about, what I had gone through. And here I am with this incredible honor. I remember taking this deep breath, and I ended up looking over my shoulder, and I turned around and looked back. And the only thing I could see for about a quarter of a mile coming out of that tunnel was a sea of red, white, and blue. It was the entire United States delegation following me in. And I was just so proud and so honored. And then at the same time, I'm very thankful to all of my fellow Olympians and all that for allowing me to bestow that honor. I was very fortunate. I think I was the first canoe kayaker to carry the flag for the United States in Sydney. And I will always have that honor, and it's an incredible alumni to be a part of.
Do you get to keep the flag? I know it's probably a dumb question, but what happens to, I know they put it sort of all on display, but do they come to you after the games and go, hey, Cliff, this is the flag you carried. This is yours to keep?
No, you have to, everybody meets by the stage there, and everybody has to give the flag to the organizing committee there, and they put it all together. So all the flags are flying together in unity. The only thing that I kept was the sash that you wear to hold the flag. So I have this thing in my drawer at home, and I've always thought to myself, maybe I should get it embroidered and, Sydney 2000 as a remembrance as I get older. But the thing about it is that I guess it's an extreme value to me. But I don't know what it is. I'd love to do that and put it kind of in a little bit of a case so I can always remember that. But for me, that was pure pride and honor to be able to represent our country.
Did you get the invite, Malcolm, to go along to Sydney to watch him at all? Or were you sitting on your couch? I don't know, probably would have been about like 4 a.m. or something for you. I can imagine watching that, given the time difference between Australia and the US.
Yeah, I was watching it and, cheering for everybody, really. It's just a wonderful thing every 4 years. But knowing somebody actually being in the Olympic Games and knowing this incredible man who is with the entire delegation of America who honored him with this situation of carrying the flag was just mind blowing, truly mind.
It's such an incredible story, and I'm so honored to be able to have you both on the show today to share it and learn more about it. But obviously people who are watching or listening to this right now, if they want to learn more, stay up to date with what you guys are doing, of course, even if you're in the US maybe and want to organize you to come and speak somewhere, twosparksofinspiration.com is the website. Is there anywhere else that people can follow this journey? Cliff, yourself, social media, things like that people can stay up to date with what you've got going on out there?
Yeah, Dr. Lesavoy and I, as you mentioned, we have two Sparks. So go to our Instagram page and you could get a hold of us there through messaging. For me, go to cliffmeidl.com and you could get a hold of me or just Google my name. And same thing with Dr. Lesavoy at Lesavoy Plastic Surgery, right?
Yep.
You answered my next question. I was going to say, if you're in California and need some surgery done, I mean, we need to get you some more of this. Do you want more of the like back what you're doing in the 80s versus the breast enhancements and things like that, or are you happy doing that now? I mean, I don't know. Plug right now what you want to do out there.
You're talking to me.
Yeah,
Sorry.
well, I mean, I don't know if Cliff's got his plastic surgery. I mean, he's doing that too. I mean, we'll give him a call as well.
I need some.
No, I do miss the innovative stuff that I used to do quite a bit of. Now I'm doing basically things to survive financially, which is basically aesthetic surgery, facelifts and breasts and tummy tucks and nose jobs, things of that sort. But I do from time to time, I do have lots of people around the country and actually around the world conferring and consulting with me. And so I do enjoy that. And from time to time, I have these very difficult reconstructive procedures or fixing other problems that other surgeons have. So I do enjoy the challenges.
Well, we enjoyed having you both on the show today, learning more about this incredible story, guys. Thank you so much for joining us here and Off the Podium, and best of luck for both of you with everything moving forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.